The twilight over the Anzio beachhead on a cold February evening in 1944 was a canvas for dread. Sirens wailed, their mournful cries swallowed by the thunderous roar of distant engines. German FW-190 fighter bombers, black silhouettes against the bruised sky, dove towards the Allied positions with terrifying speed. Below, amid the sandbagged emplacements and dugouts, the men of Battery C, 403rd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Automatic Weapons Battalion, 1st Platoon, braced themselves. Their M140mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, sleek and menacing, tracked the approaching targets, their barrels swiveling with frantic urgency. Sergeant Frank Miller, a man of quiet intensity and unnerving observational skills, gripped the controls of his Bofors gun. His face, smudged with grease and exhaustion, was illuminated by the flickering glow of the rangefinder's display. Beside him, Private First Class Joe Moretti, the loader, meticulously fed clips of 40mm shells into the breech, his movements precise, despite the pounding fear in his chest. Corporal Ben Carter, the rangefinder operator, called out distances and speeds, his voice strained but steady. This scene was a nightly ritual, a desperate dance against the Luftwaffe's relentless probing. Yet despite their training, their courage, and the sheer volume of ordnance expended, a grim truth hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. Hitting these fast-moving aircraft was a monumental, almost impossible task. The standard doctrine, taught rigorously, involved predicting the enemy plane's trajectory and leading it by a calculated distance, visually estimating where it would be by the time the shell arrived. But the Focke-Wulfs were fast, twisting, and relentless. The tracers, luminous arcs against the darkening sky, seemed to chase after the planes, often sailing harmlessly behind them, a heartbreaking testament to the futility of their efforts. Gunners believed they were doing everything right, aiming exactly where the manual told them to, yet the planes seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to evade their fire. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The air around Miller's position vibrated with the continuous thud of their own guns and the sickening whistle of bombs falling nearby. He fired, his knuckles white, watching his tracers stream out, a brilliant orange ribbon against the gloom. Another near miss. Another German plane banked sharply, released its payload and roared away, seemingly untouched. Lieutenant David Johnson, the platoon leader, stood a few yards away, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the retreating enemy. He knew the statistics as well as anyone. A mere 1 to 2% hit rate was considered acceptable, often requiring tens of thousands of rounds fired to bring down a single aircraft. Captain Thomas Hammer Henderson, the battery commander, could be heard cursing over the field phone, his frustration a palpable weight carried by every man in the battery. "It's like shooting at ghosts," Moretti yelled over the din, wiping sweat from his brow. Carter just shook his head, his face a mask of grim resignation. "They always get away, don't they?" Miller said nothing, but a flicker of something new, something dangerously close to an idea, began to stir in the depths of his exhaustion. Frank Miller wasn't just another recruit. Growing up on a sprawling farm in rural Missouri, he'd honed an uncanny ability for observation and a practical, hands-on understanding of mechanics. Before the war, he was a skilled hunter, capable of leading a pheasant precisely based on its flight path, its speed, and the wind. He'd also spent years tinkering with farm machinery, always seeking to understand how things worked and how they could work better. This innate talent for seeing patterns, for understanding trajectories, and for practical problem-solving would become his most formidable weapon. When he joined the army, his sharpshooting skills quickly earned him a reputation, but even he found the rapid, three-dimensional chess of anti-aircraft gunnery profoundly humbling. The standard AA gunnery doctrine drilled into every man was a meticulous, mathematically derived system. Gunners were taught to use optical sights, often with complex analog computers that helped estimate lead. The theory was sound: calculate the target's speed, range, and direction, then aim a proportional distance ahead. The Bofors, with its high rate of fire at 120 rounds per minute and impressive muzzle velocity of 881 meters per second, was designed to put a wall of steel in the path of an enemy. But in practice, the human element, the sheer chaos of combat, and the unpredictable maneuvers of an agile fighter bomber often rendered these calculations moot. Miller remembered a particularly harrowing engagement just days earlier. A group of Heinkel He-111 bombers had come in low, their undersides gleaming in the afternoon sun. He'd tracked them perfectly, or so he thought, his tracers appearing to intersect their flight path. Yet the bombers had continued their stately procession, unleashing their deadly cargo with impunity before wheeling away. Moretti had slammed his fist against the gun shield in exasperation, while Carter had mumbled, "I swear I had him, Sarge, right in the crosshairs." It wasn't just their gun. The entire battery had fired a torrent of shells, transforming the sky into a hellish kaleidoscope of smoke and explosions, only for the squadron of bombers to escape largely unscathed. The stakes were impossibly high. Every bomber that made it through meant devastation for the Allied troops and supplies crammed onto the beachhead, struggling for every inch against German counterattacks. The constant fear, the deafening roar of the guns, the acrid smell of burnt propellant hanging heavy in the air, the rhythmic click of spent brass casings hitting the deck. It was all part of a relentless, brutal symphony of frustration. The sound of a diving plane, followed by the terrifying whistle of a bomb, then the concussive blast, was etched into the very fabric of their existence. The psychological toll was immense. Every missed shot felt like a personal failure, a direct contribution to the enemy's continued reign of terror from above. It was during another one of those relentless twilight raids, the German aircraft streaking across the sky, that Sergeant Miller experienced his epiphany. His Bofors gun had just ceased firing, its barrel still smoking, after another fruitless volley. He was watching his tracers, the glowing orange orbs, sail past a distant FW-190, seemingly meters behind the aircraft's tail. Frustration, a familiar companion, gnawed at him. But this time, instead of immediately reloading, he paused, his gaze fixed on the fading light of the tracers and the distant escaping aircraft. He noticed something peculiar. Occasionally, a plane would jink or climb, and a tracer that looked like it was going to miss would suddenly improbably connect. It was as if his eyes and brain were consistently underestimating the true lead required, smoothing out the plane's speed, making it appear slower than it actually was, or rather, making the distance required for the shell to travel seem shorter than it was in reality. His mind flashed back to hunting pheasants, to the subtle, almost subconscious adjustment he made, aiming far, far ahead of the bird, almost to where it would be several seconds later, not just the next moment. The human eye, he realized, perceives motion in a way that can be deceptive for such high-speed, three-dimensional targets. It wasn't just about calculating the lead. It was about perceiving the lead in a fundamentally different way. The standard doctrine focused on the mathematical point of interception, but Miller suspected that the gunner's natural visual perception, coupled with the pressure of combat, caused them to consistently aim too close to the perceived future position, effectively underleading the target. The 40mm Bofors round traveled at 881 meters per second, but a fast fighter could cover a significant distance in the time it took the shell to reach its maximum effective range of 3,800 meters. The target was moving fast, and the shell took time. He needed to aim not at the plane, but at an empty patch of sky where the plane would be a second or two later, a point that felt almost ridiculously far ahead. During the quiet lulls between raids, Miller began to experiment. He'd watch birds, sketching their flight paths in the dirt, imagining them as FW-190s. He started to visualize a cone of fire that needed to intercept a moving point in space, not just a line. The genius trick, he realized, wasn't a mathematical revelation as much as a perceptual recalibration. It was about divorcing his aiming from the immediate visual of the aircraft and instead focusing on an abstract, much further ahead point. He called it aiming at tomorrow. He tried to explain it to Moretti and Carter, who listened with polite skepticism. "Sarge, you're saying we should aim at nothing?" Moretti asked, his brow furrowed. Lieutenant Johnson, hearing whispers of Miller's theories from other men, dismissed them as combat fatigue. "Sergeant Miller, stick to the book," he'd advised sternly. The established doctrine was sacred, born of years of testing and war games. To suggest it was flawed, even implicitly, was bordering on insubordination. The psychological resistance was immense. Men had been trained a certain way. They believed in the system, and the idea of fundamentally altering their approach based on one man's feeling was difficult to accept. "We've always done it this way, Miller," Captain Henderson had growled once, a definitive end to any discussion. The opportunity for Miller to test his radical new approach came just a few nights later. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and exhaustion. Another German raid was inbound, the ominous drone of engines growing louder by the second. Lieutenant Johnson gave the order to open fire, and the familiar rhythm of the guns began. But on Sergeant Miller's gun, something was different. He didn't just track the target. He seemed to anticipate its movement with an almost unnerving intuition. His aiming was no longer a fluid, continuous adjustment based on the plane's immediate position. Instead, he would fix his gaze on a point in the sky, far, far ahead of where the optical sight suggested, almost as if he was aiming at empty air. He was using landmarks in the sky, a cloud formation, a distant star, to mentally plot the plane's projected course, and then, with a sharp, decisive movement, he would swing the barrel dramatically forward, leading the target by what seemed to be an excessive distance. His crew watched, bewildered. Moretti, reloading, glanced at Carter, who shrugged, equally perplexed. Miller's method felt almost reckless, a blatant disregard for the calibrated optical sights and standard procedures. A single Focke-Wulf 190, its engine screaming, came in for a strafing run, its silhouette briefly framed against the moon. Miller's gun opened fire. Instead of the usual stream of tracers trailing behind, these rounds seemed to arc far ahead, a shimmering, deadly spear of light. For a heart-stopping second, it looked like a complete miss. Then, with a deafening crack, the FW-190 suddenly blossomed into a fireball, a direct hit. The plane shuddered violently, smoke pouring from its engine before spiraling downwards in a fiery descent, crashing into the distant hills. A stunned silence fell over the gun emplacement, quickly replaced by a chorus of shouts and cheers. Moretti let out a primal yell of triumph. Carter stared, his mouth agape. Did we actually get one?" he stammered, disbelief warring with elation. Lieutenant Johnson, who had witnessed the impossible shot, rushed over, his face a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. "Sergeant Miller, what in God's name did you do?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Miller, his face still grim, wiped a sleeve across his brow. "I aimed at tomorrow, Lieutenant," he said, the words cutting through the lingering tension. The statistics spoke for themselves. In an engagement that typically yielded near misses and frustration, Miller's gun had scored a confirmed kill, with a remarkably small expenditure of ammunition. The transformation from doubt to belief was swift and absolute within that small crew. It was a single hit, but it was a single hit that shattered the conventional wisdom of AA gunnery. Word of Sergeant Miller's tomorrow shot spread like wildfire through the battery. At first it was met with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Other gun crews, led by veterans like Sergeant Williams from the 2nd Platoon and the gruff Sergeant Davies from the 3rd, came to observe. They watched Miller, studying his unorthodox aiming technique, trying to discern the secret in his movements. It wasn't a physical trick, but a mental one, and articulating it proved to be Miller's next great challenge. "You've got to feel the plane's movement, not just see it," Miller would try to explain, his hands sketching invisible arcs in the air. "And then you throw the lead out like you're aiming at the next day, not just the next second." He showed them how to mentally project the plane's course, then aim at an almost impossibly distant point along that trajectory, trusting the shell to meet it. The resistance to this radical departure from established doctrine was, predictably, fierce in some quarters. Captain Henderson, a man who lived and breathed military manuals, was initially furious. "Sergeant Miller, are you suggesting our training is flawed? Are you saying decades of artillery science are wrong?" He'd boomed, his face red with indignation. But Lieutenant Johnson, a pragmatist at heart, had seen the results firsthand. "Captain, I saw it with my own eyes. His gun hit a Focke-Wulf that no one else could touch. We need to understand how he did it." Johnson's support was crucial. Slowly, Cautiously, other gunners began to try Miller's method. Initially, their attempts were clumsy, often overcompensating or underleading in new and bewildering ways. But as Miller patiently coached them, emphasizing the shift in perceptual focus, some began to have breakthroughs. Sergeant Williams' crew, after a week of intense practice and Miller's guidance, brought down a reconnaissance plane, their first confirmed kill in months. The impact was undeniable. In subsequent raids over Anzio, Miller's platoon, and then others who adopted his technique, began to show a marked improvement in their effectiveness. The previous 1–2% kill rate was still a distant memory. Now, in some engagements, they were seeing 5 to 7% of enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed. German pilots, who had previously considered Anzio flak more of an annoyance than a genuine threat, began to report increased accuracy. The ground fire over the beachhead has become suddenly deadly, a Luftwaffe pilot's captured debriefing report stated. The psychological advantage began to shift. The Allied gunners, once resigned to their futility, now fought with a renewed sense of purpose and a growing confidence that they could indeed hit their targets. The exceptional performance of the Anzio anti-aircraft batteries soon caught the attention of higher command. General Mark Clark's 5th Army headquarters noted the anomalous increase in enemy aircraft losses around the beachhead, particularly from 40mm Bofors units. An inquiry was launched, and Sergeant Frank Miller found himself explaining his genius trick to a panel of incredulous, then increasingly intrigued senior officers. Documenting his method, however, proved challenging. It wasn't a formula, but an intuitive shift in perception. A former mathematician turned major, Arthur Vance, assigned to the inquiry, observed Miller for days, meticulously charting his eye movements, his targeting adjustments, and his verbal descriptions. Vance eventually translated Miller's experiential knowledge into a teachable model, an almost spiritual guide to visual lead estimation that could be adapted by other gunners. Official testing followed, far from the chaos of the front lines, on a controlled range with towed targets simulating enemy aircraft. Miller's crew consistently outperformed other veteran crews using traditional methods, often by a factor of 3 or 4 in terms of accuracy and rounds per kill. The results were startling. A directive was issued across the theater. Sergeant Miller's technique, now officially termed dynamic lead perception, was to be taught to every anti-aircraft gunner. Miller, promoted to staff sergeant, found himself leading mobile training teams, traveling from one AA unit to another across Italy, then into France after the Normandy landings. He instructed hundreds of gunners, emphasizing the mental shift required, the leap of faith in aiming so far ahead. The impact was profound. Allied pilots, who had long resigned themselves to the omnipresent but largely ineffective flak, began to notice a tangible difference. The air over the German lines feels heavier now, reported a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot during Operation Cobra. Meanwhile, enemy pilots' intercepted radio chatter and debriefings revealed growing concern. Flak over the American sectors is no longer a joke, one Luftwaffe pilot stated grimly. They are hitting us with increasing regularity. The statistical impact was dramatic. Across the European theater of operations, where Miller's technique was adopted, overall AA hit rates climbed from the abysmal 1 to 2% to an average of 5 to 7%, and in some engagements, even higher. This seemingly small percentage increase translated into hundreds of downed aircraft, saved lives, and preserved crucial infrastructure. For Miller, however, the personal cost was immense. He became a legend, but also a ghost, constantly moving, constantly teaching, the weight of responsibility for the lives his method saved and the lives it took etched onto his weary soul. The endless travel, the mental strain of constantly visualizing death and destruction, left him a man perpetually on edge, even when the guns were silent. The ultimate test of Sergeant Miller's revolutionary technique came during the brutal winter of 1944, amidst the raging fury of the Battle of the Bulge. A critical choke point, a bridge over the Amblev River near Stavelot, was being fiercely contested. It was vital for the Allied counter-offensive. Intelligence reported a massive Luftwaffe assault inbound, aiming to destroy the bridge and halt the American advance. An entire anti-aircraft brigade, many of its gun crews personally trained by Miller, now a master sergeant, dug in around the bridge. He was there, not just to supervise, but to stand beside his men. As the first wave of German Ju-88 bombers and FW-190 fighter bombers appeared on the horizon, the sky over the Ardennes erupted. This was no longer the frustrated, almost random flak of Anzio. This was a coordinated, precise symphony of anti-air fire. Master Sergeant Miller, ever the gunner, moved to an available Bofors, taking the controls, demonstrating his method for any who might need a reminder. The air vibrated with the incessant thump-thump-thump of the 40mm cannons, the crackle of exploding shells, and the desperate roar of aircraft engines. But this time the wall of flak was different. It wasn't just a barrier, it was a deadly net, cast with an almost prescient accuracy. Shell after shell found its mark. Plane after plane, previously thought untouchable, faltered, smoked, and spiraled into the snowy forests below. A Ju-88, aiming directly for the bridge, was suddenly engulfed in a blinding flash, disintegrating mid-air, its fragments raining down like metallic confetti. Then, an FW-190, banking sharply after its attack run, caught a burst of 40mm fire across its wing, tearing it apart. The sky, once full of menacing black shapes, began to fill with plumes of black smoke, marking the demise of the German air armada. Dozens of enemy aircraft were confirmed destroyed in a few terrifying hours. The Luftwaffe attack was decisively broken, its remnants scattering back to their bases, their mission a catastrophic failure. Captain Henderson, now a colonel, found Miller beside his Bofors, his face streaked with grime but a quiet triumph in his eyes. "Master Sergeant Miller," Henderson said, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved this bridge. You saved hundreds of lives today." Miller simply nodded, then looked over at Moretti and Carter, who were sharing a flask of coffee, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief. Lieutenant Johnson, now a major, clapped Miller on the shoulder. The quiet camaraderie, forged in the terror of Anzio and hardened by countless battles, spoke volumes. General Patton himself, hearing the reports, sent a commendation. The bridge was held, crucial supplies flowed, and the Allied counter-offensive continued. The innovation born from one man's observation had not only transformed anti-aircraft warfare, but had directly impacted the strategic outcome of a pivotal battle. When the war finally ended, Frank Miller returned to the quiet rhythms of civilian life in Missouri. He didn't seek glory, nor did he boast of his wartime achievements. He opened a small machine shop, indulging his passion for invention and practical problem-solving. Moretti, Carter, and Johnson, forever bound by their shared experiences, visited him often, their reunions filled with quiet laughter and solemn remembrance. Miller's wartime innovation, however, continued to resonate. His dynamic lead perception, refined and integrated into new fire control systems, became standard doctrine for anti-aircraft gunnery worldwide. What began as an intuitive adjustment of human perception was eventually translated into sophisticated algorithms, influencing the design of post-war radar-guided anti-aircraft guns and later, early surface-to-air missile systems where predictive targeting became paramount. The story of Frank Miller served as a powerful testament to the idea that innovation often arises from the most unexpected places, not just from high-level research labs, but from the keen observation and practical ingenuity of an individual soldier facing desperate circumstances. The war, a crucible of necessity, had forged not just heroes, but thinkers who challenged established norms. Decades later, Miller would sometimes sit on his porch, watching a modern jet contrail etch a line across the sky. He would look up, no longer with the dread of incoming bombers, but with a profound understanding of the complex physics at play, knowing that the sky above was a little safer, a little more secure because of a simple trick he'd discovered in the heat of battle. Sergeant Frank "Hawk" Miller, the man who taught anti-aircraft guns to hit, faded into history as a quiet hero whose legacy profoundly shaped modern air defense, a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity against overwhelming odds. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.